So welcome to class. The first thing I'll do is share my screen with the class notes. And I just want to say not many students have handed in the first draft so far. So what I'm doing is I'm adjusting the schedule a little bit. I know I said that here's today. I know I said the first draft is due today. That would be great, but clearly people need a little more time. So I'm pushing back the due date for the second draft to the second draft. I'm pushing it back to January 31st. And that'll give those of you who have not handed in a first draft yet, please try to do so. You could try to do so by Thursday, but by pushing the second draft back to Tuesday the 31st, really that gives everybody a little bit more time.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Okay, yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. This week, we do have a class on Thursday. That's going to be the library class. So the librarian is going to visit us in class. Here, it'll be a virtual class, and the librarian will co-host and will take us through the library and show you some more aspects of the library. And so it's a good time if you have questions about using the library or finding a particular source for your particular essay. That would be a good time to be able to ask questions. So let's see. I am pushing this essay back, and then let's just see about the rest of the term. I just want to remind everybody the term goes away really quickly. Okay, and so we're going to try and squeeze everything in if we can. And I'll just make what adjustments I have to make along the way. But for now, I only have 3 essays from people, so I know that everybody's out there busy working on the essays. So what I'd like to do is ask those of you who have not yet submitted the essay number 2 to ask you perhaps to share what you're thinking about. For example, maybe you have an idea of which civil rights, which amendments you might be writing about or might want to write about. And maybe if we share some of those ideas in class, it'll help some of the other students to focus a little bit more. And I was hoping to do that. So let's see who's here who has not sent in an essay yet. I'm just gonna, unless somebody wants to volunteer, anybody have an idea about what they might be writing about and could share that with us to help the others think more about what they should focus on? Anybody want to volunteer? Let's just see if anybody's got any ideas. Let's see. How about Kate? Kate, do you have an idea about what you want to write about? Maybe?
Yes, I'm actually working on the freedom of speech and, like the freedom to like choose the religion, to practice it and all of that. I mean, for me, that's going to be the easiest topic, which I could like give a bunch of samples and to put them in a lot of words that will also help me fill the 600 words easily. What else? I'm also, I think, thinking of, I don't know.
Okay, no, that's fine. Okay, so that's really good. So everybody, you can see what she started to do was to focus on the First Amendment. And I think it's freedom of speech and freedom of religion are the 2 ideas she has right away. I just want to say that if you only focus on 2, you could only focus on 2 and not do 3, but you just have to write a little bit more about each. So if you have a lot to say about 2 of them, you could focus your essay that way. That's all right. But yeah, you or anybody, right? So so for the others, that's one way to do it, is to focus on that First Amendment and then pick out a couple of different freedoms, civil rights from the First Amendment. But let's see who else has maybe an idea about what they might want to write about. How about, okay, Jessica, go ahead.
Okay, so for me, it's more like a question because I'm writing and I choose freedom of speech, but for me, it's pretty similar to freedom of the press. So
Okay.
you can give us some, what is different or some options about those 2.
Okay, That's, yes, surely. So freedom of speech is really thought of as freedom of expression, meaning any way anybody wants to express their ideas. So certainly speaking, and that's fine, but also art or music, different ways in which people express their thoughts. So freedom of dance, even freedom of expression. Now, I know saying art and music and dance might not stimulate anybody's thought about freedom of speech, but so the primary idea is to be able to say what's on your mind. So, for example, a lot of people these days talk about cancel culture. A lot of these days, these people are sensitive about the words that other people use, either to describe themselves or to describe others. Now, it doesn't matter which side, how you feel about it. You can feel it's a good thing, you can feel it's a bad thing. That's not the issue here. But freedom of speech relates to what pronouns we use to talk to other people, talk about other people, what words we use to describe other people. So I'm speaking in general to everybody. If you want to write about freedom of speech, you could certainly write about an issue such as that. Maybe you have preferred pronouns. Maybe there's a reason you want to be referred to by a particular pronoun. Maybe you don't like the idea of having to use certain pronouns to address certain people or to refer to other people. Maybe you want to write about that. So freedom of speech has a lot of very broad, there's a very broad spectrum in terms of the kinds of things that freedom of speech relates to. But the other thing you mentioned was freedom of the press. Now, freedom of the press, really, the press in those days, in the days that the Bill of Rights was written, the press meant the printing press, and the chief function of the printing press was to print newspapers or newsletters. They didn't have, kind of newspapers we have today. They had 1-2 page newspapers. But freedom of the press really means freedom for the news. Because many of the founding fathers, especially Jefferson, felt that if people are going to vote and for people and they're going to determine who's going to be in government, that the people who did the voting, the citizens, needed to be educated, and they didn't have information in order to make an informed decision, intelligent decision about whom to vote for. So Jefferson, for example, he supported universities. He started the University of Virginia, I believe, and because he was so in support of the idea of education for everybody. But the point of freedom of the press is to allow for the free flow of information among the people. So the idea was, you might note that newspapers usually, they're not taxed. They have a price on them. You can buy a newspaper for $1 these days. In the old days, you could buy them for 5 cents, for 15 cents, but there's no tax on newspapers, because the chief way in the old days that the king would control the press, would control the news, and the newspapers would be by placing a tax on them. If you tax something, it makes it more expensive. If something more expensive, people are going to be less inclined to buy it. So one of the ways that freedom of the press is expressed in the United States is that the government cannot tax newspapers, for example. But that also means that the government can't interfere, can't restrict newspapers, the press, from news reporters. And these days, of course, there's lots of news on television, there's lots of news on the internet, there's lots of news on social media. So that whole idea about the press has really been expanded to all forms of communication related to information and the news. And perhaps you know about some of the scandals with Elon Musk. He took over Twitter, and perhaps you know that prior to him taking over, there was lots of restriction of people's ability to participate in Twitter. And people talked about that as freedom of speech, but it's also freedom of the press. So depending on who's being restricted, you could talk about it as freedom of speech or freedom of the press. So President Trump was taken off Twitter. Lots of people were taken off Twitter because the government decided that it was not a good thing. They couldn't do anything directly, so they worked with Twitter to limit those people's access to the software. So all kinds of controversy related to that. But the idea behind freedom of the press and freedom of speech is that the government can't restrict what people say and how people find out about it. So those are two really very important issues. And there's a lot to say about that. And certainly there's a lot on the news about those kinds of things. So you can find information about it really easily. I like those topics. Anybody else want to share what they're thinking of writing?
Thank you.
Oh, sure, sure. Anybody else want to share what they're thinking of writing about? We're not going to hold you to it. You must have given it some thought. I hope you gave it some thought. Because the essays were supposed to be due today. Let me share that now that a few more people are here. Let me go up there and share that again. Okay, so here we are today, Tuesday the 24th. The first draft of essay number 2 is supposed to be in today. Most of you haven't done that. So I pushed back the date to Thursday, and then I pushed back the date for the second draft to, it says January 26th, but I want it to be that day, January 31st. So this gives everybody a little bit more time to get essay number 2, get it together. You didn't do it, most of you didn't get it in today, but maybe you can get it in by tomorrow, maybe you can get it in Thursday or Friday or Saturday. There's enough time for me to comment on it, give you feedback. And then if you need to do a second draft, some of you don't, you need to do a second draft, you'll have time to do that. Because I'm still planning to move ahead with the third essay next Tuesday. So we have one more week in here for essay number 2. That being said, does anybody else maybe want to share a little bit about what they're thinking about for essay?
Professor, I actually have a question.
Yes, David.
If we like how our essays are written in the first draft, can we keep it that way? Can we keep it as is and just
Yes.
like resubmit it for the final grade?
Yes, you're happy with your grade with the first draft of essay number 1. You do not have to go on to a second draft. You can take the grade that you got. That's just fine. You will, I'm sure you'll still look at the comments and try to apply that learning to the next time you write the next essay.
Yes, exactly.
That's the whole idea. And
Thank you.
yes, and for sure, the grades, if some of you got a little lower grade in the earlier essay, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is to progress. So if you didn't get such a great grade on the first essay, but you get a better grade on the second and a better grade on the third, well, then you're showing the progress that you really need to show. And I'll use those later grades to base your course grade on. So usually people do that. Usually people improve during the term and their grades go up, and that's what counts for the final grade.
Thank you.
Sure. So anybody else thinking about the essay number 2, what they might write about? Any ideas? Okay, so if you're not thinking about essay number 2, why don't I bring up an essay number 2 for us all to look at, and maybe by going through that, some of you will have some other ideas about what you want to write about for your essay number 2. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen here and use this essay here. This is from another student from a different class, but it's all about same essay. So let's take a look how this student handled this essay. She has her introduction, and she takes a little historical view in the introduction. You don't have to do that, but she did. After the Declaration of Independence was released in 1776, America as a new country was created. Having suffered from the oppression of British colonial rule for a long time, founding fathers decided to create a different kind of country from the monarchy, namely a democratic and free country. Thus, the U.S. Constitution uses the doctrine of separation of powers. You remember separation of powers. That's the fact that they set up a constitution with 3 different parts of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. They separated the powers of the government. They did that following Montesquieu, this guy's name here. It's a philosopher. He's got a very long name. Most everybody refers to him as Montesquieu. So here, this student did some research and found out that this idea about separation of powers was really put forth by Montesquieu 20, 30 years before the American Revolution. This is a well-known thing, but so I'm sure it came up readily in her internet searches, and she decided to put that idea into her introduction, which is fine. You don't have to do that. You don't have to take an historical look at the US at the Bill of Rights. You can just talk about how the Bill of Rights applies today and issues related to today. But in this case, the student decided to have that historical reference. Among these are the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution, also known as the Bill of Rights, which are the cornerstones of the US Constitution. The significance of the Bill of Rights is to replace government power with legal power and to maximize the protection of the citizens' rights. It's really, really a very nice way of phrasing what was going on. Remember when we talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I kept saying about liberty. Liberty means freedom under the law. And here, that's what this student is saying. Government power, really arbitrary power, say exercised by the king, replace that with the legal power, with the law. And that's definitely the concept that was behind what they were doing here when they created this. And to maximize the protection of citizens' rights, that's of course what it's all about. So it's a very nice introduction, ending with the thesis statement here. It's really good. And then she first starts to talk about the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects civil rights by limiting the legislative power of Congress. Right? It starts out like this: Congress shall make no law. So very clear statement there. Reflecting the concerns at the time that the federal Congress was expanding its power and oppressing people in the states. So the idea was to limit government. Is that First Amendment. And here she just deals with the freedom of religion. Right? There's more to the First Amendment, but you're just dealing with freedom of religion. In this part, it's clear that the law respects and protects people's freedom of religion. So that's great. Then for an example, she uses an example that's contrary to that. However, not all religious beliefs are protected by the First Amendment. So many of you, when you're writing, when you're coming up with examples, if you find fault with any of the freedoms of civil rights, especially faults with the way they're implemented. Remember, they're all theory, and we all deal in daily life with practice. So you can use that kind of example to show how, well, it's supposed to protect, it's supposed to give everybody freedom of religion, as in this case, but here's an example of where it doesn't do that. Here, for example, Mormons claim that freedom of religion and the law of Mormon allow polygamy. Polygamy is a social practice where there's one husband and several wives. And the Mormons, a religious group that practice this way of living, one man and several wives. However, the government arrested many Mormons in 1879 on charges of bigamy. Bigamy is the word that we use in the United States for a person who has more than one wife or more than one husband. Because the law says one woman, one wife and one husband. These days a little different. But here, look, 1879. The Constitution of the United States was written in 1789. So it's only 90 years, right? 90 years after the Constitution is written. All these people want to put freedom of religion, but in reality, the Mormons were not able to practice their religion freely. The reason given was that the individual freedom of belief was not above the law. And polygamy, there's a quote here, a reference here, polygamy violated good order and peace. Clearly there's law against it. But what the student has done here is she's done some research and relating to freedom of religion, and she found this exception, this idea that, oh, here, the Mormons weren't allowed to practice their religion freely. And of course, I'm sure you could find other types of examples for other things But the idea is that she defined the freedom of religion here. The law respects and protects people's freedom of religion. And then she found an exception from her research, and she put it in there. Very good. Good way to present the whole issue. And then she moves on to the Second Amendment. So here in this essay, she takes one freedom from the First Amendment, freedom of religion, and then she takes the Second Amendment, and then she's going to go on to the 10th Amendment. So she, using the whole document of the Bill of Rights, she's choosing which things she wants to write about. Here she goes. Next, the right of the people to own guns comes from the Second Amendment. It's great. In the Second Amendment, then she quotes it. This is the entire Second Amendment. The First Amendment was chock full of all those 5 or 6 different civil rights. Here's the Second Amendment. It's just one sentence, basically. The advantage of the Second Amendment is it prevents the government from having too much power and thus oppress the people. When an evil government is created, people can use guns to overthrow it. This is the reason Americans legally own guns in the United States. So this is all about gun control. And once again, it doesn't matter to me which side of the issues you might be on. You might be in favor of people having guns. You might be against people having guns. You might want more gun control. You might want less gun control. But whatever you present, and that's fine. Whatever you get to choose your own point of view. But the point is here, she's putting forth this notion of defining what the Second Amendment is and then explaining why the Second Amendment is there. Of course, this is exactly what the founding fathers felt. They didn't want the government to be able to control the people. They felt that the people should be able to rise up, just like they did against the British king, and create a different government if they felt that the government was being too restrictive. Also, you might remember, they didn't want England or France or Spain to come in and enslave them again, because they just got their freedom. And in fact, England did come back in 1812 to try to take over their colonies again. And it was a war, the War of 1812, between the Americans and the British. The Americans won again. So there you are. Second paragraph deals with the Second Amendment. First paragraph deals with the First Amendment. And then the third paragraph deals with the 10th Amendment, which says the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or reserved to the states or the people. Again, one sentence, very concise. This amendment is also intended to ensure a balance of power among the states and that the government, to ensure that the government doesn't infringe on state interests. And it's exactly what it's there for. For instance, and then she gives an example. Here's a very topical example. According to this reporter in the Roe versus Wade, the overturning of Roe versus Wade ended 50 years of federal abortion rights. And that's exactly the case. 50 years ago, the Supreme Court decided, oh yes, people have a constitutional right to an abortion according to the Constitution. And so for a long time, it was a federal right, which means it applied everywhere in all the states and all the territories and everything. But then just last year, the Supreme Court overturned that. And that's what that simply means, is that it becomes the state's purview to create laws about abortion. So because of the 10th Amendment, if the court rules that the federal government doesn't have jurisdiction, federal government can't decide based on the Constitution whether somebody should get an abortion or not, then that power of decision goes to the state. And that's what the 10th Amendment is all about. Of course, Congress and the federal government could pass a law about abortion. They haven't passed any national laws about abortion, so they could do that and reinstate, for example, what was going on with Roe versus Wade. That's up to the Congress to do. And for some reason, the Democrats and the Republicans, whoever's in charge, they can't get together to pass an abortion law. So now, that's one of the reasons the Supreme Court established Roe versus Wade in the first place. They made it a federal law. And now each of the states have their own laws because we don't have a federal law, there is no law that was passed by Congress for all of the nation about abortions. So once again, here's an issue that you could write about. You could, you might be passionate about abortion. You might be for it, against it, whatever it is, just like with gun control. But here's the way this student handled it in this particular essay. And you'll notice, the student actually didn't take a stand, didn't say this is good, this is bad, or anything like that. What the student did was focus on the meaning of the 10th Amendment. Power of the 10th Amendment is, if the federal government isn't responsible for that, then the states are. And here, she focused on, for gun control, she focused on the fact that this is the reason for having the Second Amendment, so that citizens can have guns if the government gets too strong. In this one here, she pointed out a deficit with, perhaps it's a deficit, with the freedom of religion, in that the Mormons aren't allowed to practice the way they like to practice their religion. And she ties it all up here. Look how she does this. In sum, the Bill of Rights was an objection to the monarchy, whose purpose was to guarantee human rights. The purpose of the Bill of Rights was to guarantee human rights, actually civil rights, but that's okay. As Obama's 2004 speech said, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There's not a Black America, a white America, a Latino America, an Asian America. There's one United States of America. And so that's a very nice way to sort of summarize the notion of liberty, of freedom within the law, of the civil rights that the Bill of Rights is putting forth. And again, she did some research and she found this speech by President Obama, who did a very good job himself in this quote, explaining that everybody is equal before the law, one law for everybody, no one's above the law, and that's what liberty is all about. That's what civil rights are all about. Here, the Bill of Rights protects all people in all states because America does not belong to any one person, such as a king or an emperor. America belongs to all Americans. So this is a very nice essay putting forth the different ideas that the student felt were important from the Bill of Rights. Here's the work cited. Notice the title is centered. It's capital W and capital C. The works is plural. It's not underlined. It's not bolded. It's not italicized. There's no colons. It's just like that sitting in the middle. And then here are the sources. And you'll notice that the hanging indent format is used. The first line is flushed with the margin, and then the second line is indented. In each case, she's done that properly, just like that. And then you'll also notice that the items in the list are in alphabetical order by the first letter of the name that's being put there as the author, or in this case, the title. So those are a few things to remember about the works cited. So let me just stop there. I was hoping that by going over this essay, some of you might have thought about more about what you want to write about. Okay, I'm just looking at the chat. So somebody's asking, do I want you to write about 3 things? I think that it's easier to get to the 500, 600 words really is what you're looking for in this essay. It's easier to get there if you have 3 body paragraphs, and it's easier to have 3 body paragraphs if you focus on 3 of the different civil rights or amendments. But you don't have to. If you have enough to say about 2 and you want to focus on 2, that's okay. And in reality, if you have a lot to say about one of the issues and you can actually write an entire essay about, say, freedom of speech or gun control or abortion or whatever it is, you could focus on just one of those civil rights or one of those amendments. That's okay. Yes, go ahead, Kate.
Do we still have to end it with a conclusion?
You definitely need a conclusion. You need an introduction and you need a conclusion. And the conclusion is not really hard because it's just a summary of what you've already said. So it's got a title together. Yes, all formal writing is it has those bookends, the introduction and the conclusion. So you just need to keep that like that. A conclusion, if you've written a lot and you've said a lot in your essay, your conclusion doesn't have to be very long. 3 sentences is really, you can get away with that if you've done a good job in your whole essay.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So question is, does anybody else have any ideas that they want to share for what they might be writing about? I don't want to push anybody too hard. Okay, look, you need to get your essays in. I'm going to bring up the class notes again, just to remind everybody about what we're trying to do here. Class notes. Okay, so here it is, Tuesday. Again, some people came in a little late. I'm pushing back. Today was supposed to be the day that essay 2 draft 1 was due, pushing that back to Thursday and pushing the second draft back to Tuesday next week. So this gives you a little bit of leeway in here, all of you, to finish up that first draft tomorrow, the next day, Friday, even if you go to Saturday, get that first draft done, get it into me. I'll be working all weekend, taking a look at your drafts and sending them back to you. Really want to try to get everybody to be finished with the second draft of that second essay. Try and get everybody finished by next Tuesday. Today is Tuesday. So that gives us a week to do that. I don't think it's too much to ask. We will have a class on Thursday. It's going to be the library class. The librarian's going to visit us here in our classroom, co-host the session, and show us a bunch of things about the library, take us to the virtual library, show us about research and the different search engines and things of that nature. I know I showed you some of that stuff, but the librarian, of course, knows a lot more than me and does that more regularly. So they have their own things that they want to share with you. So that'll be interesting. And if you have some questions about how to use the library, or if you have a question about, you're writing your essay, maybe you can't find something, you want to find a definition of something, or you want to find an example of something, you might ask about that during the library class. And even if the librarian can't deal with it, when the librarian's done, I would help with that. All right, so anybody have any issues? I don't want to do too much tonight because you will write your essays. Yes.
Yes, Professor, I have a question about essay number 3.
Yes.
Because I would like to start to work on it.
Yes.
But I'm not sure about the topic, so I don't want to.
Okay, for essay number 3, the topic is going to be very similar to the first 2. Now, we're going to be reading the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We'll go through that together. And that has 32 articles. The Bill of Rights had 10 amendments, only 10. This has 32. So we'll go through all of that. And then I'm going to say to you, you can choose 3 of those articles to write about, or some of those articles, like the amendments, have more than one issue in that article. So you could take a piece of one of those articles. Or for the third essay, you could certainly focus on any one issue that you want to focus about, any of those articles of human rights talks about. So there's a lot of freedom in that.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much.
Right. Okay, well, let's go back to essay number 2. Anybody have any questions? You really need, as I said, I only got a few. So I really need you all to put your noses to the grindstone and get some drafts in. If you're not sure about your draft, if you've done part of it, send it in to me. But really, at this point, you pretty much know what the essay should look like. So I would expect fuller drafts from you. Please do that. Anybody have any issues? Not sure what to do? All right, we're not doing much in class, so you have some time to write your essay. So when you sign off, get some ideas written. Do it. I'll see you on Thursday. Good night, everybody.
Good
Thank
night.
you, Professor.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.